Hey everybody, welcome back. Hopefully you had a helpful discussion following our last session, and I hope you did a bit of prep work for today's session. As we've discovered during our time together, life is all about decision making. Your decisions determine the direction and the quality of your life, including, and this is where we're going today, including the decisions you make in response to decisions other people make about you, your responses. It's easy to forget that a response is a decision. And as we're about to discover, a measured response in contrast to an emotionally fueled eye for an eye reaction. A measured response has the power to reverse the course of a life, thwart the intentions of evil people, and heal the hurts inflicted on us by others. Never underestimate the power of a measured response. As we're going to discover in today's session, the responses, the decisions, that have the potential to reverse the natural order of things, the responses that have the potential to turn things around, they're not natural. They're the decisions that legends and legacies are made of. So this is a really big deal. In fact, it's as big as your entire life. And that sets us up for our third question, the conscience question. And the conscience question is this: is there a tension that deserves my attention? Is there a tension that deserves my attention? Sometimes, in fact, more times than we want to admit, when we're making a decision, an option we're considering creates a little bit of tension inside of us, right? There's something about it that just doesn't seem exactly right. It gives us pause. It causes us to hesitate. And a lot of times we have no idea why. My dad refers to this experience as a red flag moment. My whole life I heard this. I think I have a red flag about that, a red flag moment. And when we have those red flag moments, we should pause. We should pause and pay attention to the tension. We need to pause and ask, why does this bother me? Don't ignore it. Don't brush by it. Don't rush by it. Don't brush it off. Pay attention. Pay attention to that internal tension. Now, when you hear all that, you may find yourself thinking, Andy, okay, I don't know. I don't really make decisions based on emotions. I just look at the facts and then I decide based on the facts. And no offense, but actually you don't. I know you think you do. We all think we do. But the folks who study the human brain tell us that when we have these red flag moments, these inner hesitations that don't really connect with data, it's a part of our brain that's actually alerting us to pay attention. And if we pause, we stand a better chance of making a better decision. Now, there's another version of this same phenomenon, and I'm sure this has happened to you on several occasions. You're considering something, nothing about it bothers you, there's no tension, and then somebody comes along and points out something you hadn't thought about. And suddenly, where there was no tension, there's tension. Where there was no hesitation, you find yourself second guessing your decision. Growing up, it was usually your mom, right? I mean, moms are great about that. Honey, that all sounds great, except that it's illegal. But it's not just our moms. Sometimes it's a friend. Hey, that sounds good to me, but what's your wife going to think about that when she finds out? Or, hey, does your boss know? Tension. Can you afford that? Tension. Doesn't your contract rule that out? Tension. I thought you were on a diet. That's probably meddling. Anyway, of course, the problem, and again, we've all experienced this, the problem with somebody else bringing things to our attention is that creates relational tension, doesn't it? And that's a tension you should pay attention to as well. And here's why. Because we all have a tendency to dodge the truth by discounting the truth bearer. I mean, what does he know, right? What does she know? I mean, he's never walked in my shoes. She can't even run her own life. She can't even keep her own kids under control. So as you consider your option, if there's any hesitation around a particular option, pause and allow that, and I don't know any other way to say it, pause and allow that emotion, that tension to rise up and get as big as it can possibly get before you decide. If something bothers you, let it bother you. If something about him bothers you, let it bother you. If something about her bothers you, if something about that job offer bothers you, if there's something about that invitation that's not exactly right, if there's something about that deal that causes a little hesitation, pay attention to that tension. Face it, embrace it. Don't excuse it. Face that tension until it either goes away or you decide to go a different way. Pay attention to that tension. If you don't, well, we'll get to that in just a minute. There's a fascinating narrative from the life of King David, Israel's second king, that illustrates the really the magnitude and the life-altering power of paying attention to, in his case, a seemingly irrational attention. As you know, David steps onto the pages of history as a shepherd boy. When he was a kid, a prophet showed up at his house, and this was a good day, and announced to his family that God had chosen David to be the next king of Israel. Of course, the problem was Israel already had a king, King Saul. But Saul wasn't doing a very good job kinging, so God decided to replace him. And eventually, David becomes a soldier in King Saul's army. And before long, his popularity actually overshadows King Saul's. So King Saul becomes very jealous, and he actually tries to kill David. So David flees into the wilderness and becomes a fugitive from the law. But by the time this happened, David was a folk hero due to his famous encounter with Goliath that we all know about. So by the time he exits Saul's service, he has a reputation as a warrior and as a leader. And over time, dozens and then hundreds of men flock to David's side. Before long, he has a small army of his own, but it's an army without a home. It's an army made up of men who are on the run from the law, just like David. So, as the story goes, Saul gets some good intel on where David is, and he gathers about 3,000 young soldiers into the desert of En-Gedi to find David and to remove this threat from the throne once and for all. And at some point during this grand adventure, Saul stops the entire caravan, the entire army, so he can find somewhere private to relieve himself. He spies a cave up in the hills, stops everyone, gets off of his mule, and he heads up unaccompanied to take care of business in this cave. Now, if you're familiar with this story, you know this is where the story takes a very interesting twist, because David and a handful of his merry men are hiding in that very cave. What are the odds of that? I mean, talk about the stars lining up. I mean, from David's perspective, this was a best case scenario. Now, apparently what happened was this. When David got word that Saul and his oversized posse was headed his way, he told his men to scatter until Saul and his company passed through that little canyon. And then once they were gone, David and his men would escape in the opposite direction. And everything was working according to plan until Saul got nature's call. So imagine, but don't imagine too hard. From David's perspective inside the cave, what did he see? He's looking out toward the mouth of the cave. Saul appears as a silhouette. David's eyes have already adjusted to the darkness. Saul has just walked in from that bright Middle Eastern sun. He can't see a thing. So he walks in just far enough to ensure his privacy, takes off his outer robe, hikes up his skirt, so to speak, squats down, and opens a magazine. Or maybe he didn't open a magazine. But anyway, here's the thing. What do you think? What do you think is running through David's mind at this point? I mean, this is an omen. This is a sign from God. God has physically, literally delivered his enemy into his hands. I mean, what else could this mean? I mean, he'd already been anointed king. Everybody knows he's next. The only thing standing in his way was the current king. And here he is, unguarded and as vulnerable as a king can possibly get. And if David wasn't thinking this way, we know that his men were, because the author of the story documents their response. Here's what his men said. They said, David, this is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. David, this is what you predicted. Decision made. Let's kill Saul and let's move back home. Let's move back to the city. Enough of this wilderness fugitive living. No civil war, no bloodshed. Well, minimal bloodshed. Thousands of lives will be spared. I mean, it's perfect. It was dramatic. There's no need to pray about this. Let's just do this. Kill the king before the king kills you. Besides, David, what other options are there? Remain an outlaw for the rest of our lives? I mean, this needed to end. And this was the perfect God-ordained way to end it. So you can just imagine the emotion in the cave that afternoon, the adrenaline. Imagine the pressure David felt to act, to save his men from another season of hiding out like outlaws. But David felt something else as well. There was a tension. There was an internal hesitation. Something about this wasn't exactly right, but he wasn't sure what it was. And the hesitation didn't make any sense. So he decided to act. David pulls out his dagger. He creeps up behind King Saul with every intention of ending his life. And if he's successful, the world as he and his men know it would change instantly. But as he gets closer, the tension increases. And in spite of the fact that there seemed to be no alternative, David paid attention to that tension. He paused long enough to allow what was bothering him to really bother him. And somewhere, we don't know when this happened, but somewhere between leaving the hiding place way back in the cave and King Saul's unprotected back, seconds away from a decision that everybody would understand and everyone would applaud, he gains clarity around the tension that had captured his attention. And it went something like this. Wait a minute. I'm about to murder the king. This can't be right. Besides, who put King Saul on the throne of Israel to begin with? Who made Saul king? God did. How smart would it be for me to replace what God put in place? This can't possibly be God's plan. This can't possibly be the right thing to do. I can't kill the king, even if the king is trying to kill me. So, and this is amazing, in spite of all that pressure to act, in spite of the expectations of those around him, David changes course. Now, here's where we all have something in common with David. David didn't know what the outcome of killing King Saul would be. He thought he did, but there was no guarantee that things would work out as he envisioned, right? I mean, he thought he knew, his men thought they knew, kill the king, become the king, right? It's that simple, problem solved. But there was no guarantee that that would be the outcome. Now, please don't miss this. One of the reasons we ignore the tension when we're making a decision, one of the reasons we push through and ignore the advice of other people around us, the voice of our conscience, is we believe we can predict outcomes. We believe we can predict outcomes, don't we? I mean, we think we know, but we don't know. We don't always predict outcomes accurately, do we? I mean, does anybody? Let me ask it this way. Have you ever been disappointed? What is disappointment? Disappointment is the result of an unexpected outcome. So here's my point. Ignoring that tension in your gut sets you up for disappointment. Paying attention to that tension is how you avoid unnecessary disappointment and regret. So back to David. He's just feet away from King Saul, and it occurs to him, just because I kill the king doesn't mean I will necessarily become the king. But one thing is for certain, I will be the man who killed the king of Israel. That will be my story for the rest of my life. That will be my legacy. That's the story I'll have to tell my children, and that's the story I'll have to tell my grandchildren, and I'll probably have to tell them over and over and over. Grandpa, tell us one more time about how you snuck up behind our great granddaddy, King Saul, while he was using the potty and slit his throat. Oh, granddaddy, you are so brave, right? That wasn't the story David wanted to tell. The author of this text tells us that David was conscience stricken. This is how we know that he was paying attention to that tension. He was paying close attention to his conscience. So David does something very few people have the self-control to do. He changed course midstream. Instead of murdering Saul, he cut off the corner of his discarded robe and heads back into the recesses of the cave. And his men are shocked. I mean, they were so close to going home only to watch this perfect opportunity slip away. The expressions on their faces must have said it all. David had some explaining to do. And here's what he said. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed." To which his men thought, well, then just let one of us do it. David continued, with these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went his way. Saul exits the cave, rejoins his men, gets back on his mule, and is preparing to continue his search for David, when suddenly he hears a voice coming from the direction of the cave. Saul, Saul, he hears his name being called. Talk about drama. 3,000 heads turn, and there stands the very man they've been hunting, the man they've been paid to kill. There stands David in the mouth of the cave King Saul just exited. Now, the text tells us that David actually bowed down to Saul from the mouth of the cave. Then he stands to his feet and he holds up the corner of Saul's garment and announces to everyone present that he could have easily murdered the king, but chose not to. And for all those gathered there that day, one thing was perfectly clear. David was the better man. He spared Saul's life when Saul would have taken his. After a short speech, David concludes with these powerful words, this incredible statement. Here's what he says. He said, may the Lord judge between you and me. In other words, Saul, you do your thing. I'm going to do the right thing. I will allow God to determine the outcome of this conflict. I will not take matters into my own hands. God made you king. I will not replace what God has put in place. I will not play God in your life or mine. Then he says this, may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you. In other words, Saul, I'm not going to use your bad behavior as an excuse to do bad things. I will not become you. Never underestimate the power of a measured response. Those measured, life-altering, unprecedented responses are often introduced by unexplainable, seemingly irrational tension, a red flag, a hesitation. Pay attention to that tension. It's often God's way of directing us in another direction. People whose lives are wholly yielded to God, they don't play God. They don't predict outcomes. They surrender, they obey, they follow. So pay attention to that tension. If you don't, you may wake up on the other side of a decision that you wish you could go back and unmake. Back to the story. All eyes are on Saul. What will he do? He's been humiliated by David, but interestingly enough, not by David's military skill. He was humiliated by David's humility, his character, his sensitivity to his own conscience. So what do you do in a situation like that if you're Saul? Continue the pursuit? Pursue a man who could have taken your life and everybody knows he chose not to? Even Saul knew better. So he turned his army around and he headed back to the city. Now, not too long after this humiliating encounter, King Saul and his army are embroiled in a battle with the Philistines when a random Philistine archer stationed just behind their infantry launches an arrow intended to fall randomly among the Israelite army. But this random archer's random arrow found a seam in Saul's armor and mortally wounded him. Saul doesn't want to die at the hands of his enemies, so he falls on his own sword and dies as the Israelite army is routed by the Philistines. When word reaches the city, the citizens lose no time in proclaiming David king. He becomes king without having to murder the king. And perhaps David thought to himself, well, if someone had told me it was going to work out like this, it would have certainly made that whole cave thing a lot easier. If God had shown up and said, relax, David, 7 chapters from now, I'm going to take care of this. The Philistines are going to do your work for you. Wouldn't that have made things a lot easier? But that's not how life works, is it? That's why we must pay attention to that tension. That's why we dare not take matters into our own hands. That's why we dare not trust our ability to predict the future. That's why you've got to ask yourself, is there a tension that deserves my attention? Is there a tension that deserves my attention? When my daughter, Allie, was in the 8th grade, I was helping her study for a test. And if you're a parent, you know how this works. And it occurred to me that her older brother, Garrett, had had the same teacher in the same class 2 years before. So I said, hey, let's see if we can find an old test to study from. And honestly, I didn't think we would find a test that was 2 years old. So I go digging through Garrett's stuff. And sure enough, I find an old test. And I assured Allie that, her teacher changes these tests from semester to semester. Otherwise, he wouldn't have given the test back, right? This is how it works in college. And so I convinced her it was okay to study from this old test. So the next day, she goes to take the test, and it's the same test. And when she got home, I asked what every parent who studies with their children asks, how did we do on our test, right? And she says, Dad, you're not going to believe it. It was the same test that Garrett had, and I felt like I was cheating. And I said, oh, no, that's not cheating. And then I go on to give her this long, convoluted explanation about why using an old test isn't cheating and, trying to help her conscience. And finally, she interrupts me and she says, Dad, it's okay. I told him. I'm like, what? She goes, yeah. I said, wait, you told the teacher? She said, yeah. I told him I had a copy of an old test of Garrett's test and I'd used it to study and that it was the same test. And, so now I'm feeling terrible. Like, oh no, I got my daughter into all this trouble. I said, Allie, I'm so sorry, but I'm so proud of you. I feel bad for getting you into trouble. What happened? And she said, nothing. I said, nothing. She said, yeah. He said he had planned to change the test, but at the last minute, the copy machine wasn't working, so he used an old test and that it wasn't a problem. Now, the point of the story is simply this. Allie sensed a tension. She had a decision to make, a decision she didn't anticipate she'd have to make. Do I tell my teacher or not? And when she thought about not, there was a tension. There was a conscience issue. And it didn't seem like the right thing to do in spite of what her father had told her. So she paid attention to the tension and she told the teacher the truth. And of course, I'm so glad that she did. Now, here's what I know. The decision that you're wrestling with right now, falls somewhere between choosing whether or not to tell your math teacher that you studied from an old test and murdering a king, right? But the principle is the same. If there's something in you you can't put your finger on, or perhaps something someone else has put their finger on that bothers you about an option you're considering, stop. Pay attention. Every time you make a decision, especially a decision that takes you by surprise, ask yourself, is there a tension that deserves my attention? Is there a tension that deserves my attention? And that leads us to our third decision, the conscience decision. And here's the decision I would love for you to consider right now. I will pause even when I can't pinpoint the cause of my hesitation. I will explore rather than ignore my conscience. I will explore rather than ignore my conscience. Don't ignore it. Don't brush by it. Let it bother you until you know why it bothers you, or let it bother you until you know it's okay to move forward. It may be God's way of protecting you, His way of keeping you from making a decision you will live to regret. It may be the pathway to an option you've never even considered, a response so unprecedented, so unexpected, that it reverses the natural order of things. So, one last time, is there a tension that deserves your attention? If so, pay attention to that tension. That's it for me. We'll pick it up right there next time in session 5, where we explore the maturity question. And now it's your turn to talk. Enjoy your discussion.